Okay, well, welcome to this inaugural international meeting of the different FSU organisations around the world. I'm Toby Young. I'm the General Secretary of the UK Free Speech Union. And do you guys want to introduce yourselves?
Sure. I'm Sara Gon. I'm the director of the Free Speech Union in South Africa. We're new, so we've got a lot to learn from you guys, but perhaps some of the things we'll impart will hopefully will be a bit interesting.
Well, and good morning here, good evening for you guys. This is one of the joys of doing international meetings, I guess. I'm Jonathan Ayling, the Chief Executive of the Free Speech Union New Zealand.
And I'm not, how would we describe the relationship between the FSUs? I think you are both wholly autonomous independent organisations, but I think we have licensed to you the right to use the FSU name and our branding and some of our content on our website if you want to use it.
That's right, and as a sister group of organisations that respond philosophically more to the attempts to censor in the Anglosphere, we come from a common goal, don't we? And it's more our inspiration than anything that combines us.
Yes, yeah. Well, I thought we should talk specifically about the issue of hate speech and how hate speech is being used to censor speech in all three of our respective countries. It's and as I'm sure you both know, in America, no attempt to prohibit hate speech has survived a First Amendment challenge, but we don't have the First Amendment in the UK, so we do have some hate speech laws, and there is a gradual accretion of these laws. So there are more and more things are being designated as hateful, and that's certainly true of the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Act, which received royal assent a couple of years ago, but weirdly still hasn't been activated. I think in part because the Scottish police and judiciary have said the moment you activate this, we're going to be absolutely deluged with criminal complaints, which we'll then be obliged to investigate, and we just lack the capacity to do that. We're already completely overwhelmed, and if you create this whole new plethora of speech crimes, we're just gonna go under. So they haven't yet worked out how to solve that problem, and in the meantime, it's received royal assent, but it hasn't been activated. But there's a new development here. I don't know if there are any parallels in South Africa or New Zealand, which is the Online Safety Bill. And the Online Safety Bill originally had a clause in it which obliged social media companies that are within scope of Ofcom, which is our state broadcasting regulator, but is going to be given the job of regulating social media. So social media companies within scope of Ofcom would have to say in their terms of service how they intend to address legal but harmful speech. And the legal but harmful speech the companies were going to be obliged to say how they intended to address in their terms of service were going to be defined separately in a separate supplementary piece of legislation, a statutory instrument that was going to be brought forward by the digital secretary. And the digital secretary, as was Nadine Dorries, had published an indicative list of what was likely to be in this statutory instrument, and specifically content that was legal but harmful to adults included abusive content, that is, abusing people based on their possession of various protected characteristics, such as ethnicity, gender reassignment, and so forth. Now, that's sort of gone and sort of hasn't gone. The idea that legal but harmful content that the companies will be forced to address should appear in a statutory instrument, that's gone. Instead, that content has been placed in another clause of the bill, and instead of saying how they're going to address this content, in-scope social media providers have to say what tools they're going to equip users with if they don't want to see this content. So the concept of content that's legal but hateful essentially lawful but awful, is still there in the bill, but I think it's a slight improvement insofar as making it a legal requirement for social media companies to say how they intend to address this content is a way of sort of nudging them to prohibit it. I mean, that's the easiest way of addressing it, just outright prohibiting it. And so they've in a way given social media companies slightly more latitude by saying you don't have to prescribe it if you don't want to, but you have to provide users with the tools to do so if they don't want to see it. And I think that will result in swathes of content being removed, we think, unless the bill is amended, by default. So the risk that poses to free speech is that big social media providers like Twitter and YouTube and Facebook will have their settings on safe by default. So if you want to see content that's a bit more controversial and which the providers are required to say how they intend to protect people from if they don't want to see it, you'll have to go into your settings and sort of dial down the safetyness of them. And we think that's quite problematic, and we're trying to amend the online safety bill. This is the Free Speech Union.
I think your use of the word safe is exactly appropriate there, because I think some listeners may be watching this going, well, why would people want to watch graphic content or gross obscenity? Surely most people wouldn't want to switch those safety settings off, and they're probably quite right in that regard. But what we're really talking about is maybe slightly more provocative opinions, or maybe dissenting opinions, and do we want a society that has defined its entire conversation by safety? That's really where the value of free speech comes in. So it's not that we're necessarily advocating for the lawful but awful content itself. Really, it's the capacity to have a robust conversation that will risk offence in order to continue to progress these conversations. And if we turn the safety settings on across society for that, it's troubling to see how we'll continue to move forward in these conversations.
Yes. I think it's you're right. It's defining difficult conversations, opinions you might find disagreeable and provocative, even offensive, as unsafe, which is, as you say, absolutely implicit in describing these settings as safety settings or safety tools, and that suggests that the lifeblood of democracy, which is robustly disagreeing with each other, but with a view to eventually resolving our differences, that activity has been designated unsafe, which is alarming.
Yeah, I mean, what's striking, and essentially, it's not as if we've been confronted with this for the first time, is the question of when you have a word like safe, it's almost terrifying because it suggests closing down in and of itself, and who determines it? I mean, just to give you an example, for a week, I think just before Elon Musk bought Twitter, our very modest little Twitter account, the FSU USA, was closed down. And of course, I mean, all one can do is write and say we have absolutely no idea. I didn't want to say we don't know what your terms are, but we didn't know what their terms are. We hadn't paid much attention, but we couldn't possibly think of anything that we'd said that could cause such offense. It seemed to have been resolved within a day or two, but it literally, something as absolutely small and innocuous as our sort of new account went down. And it's just there's something really creepy about watching hard-won rights, the result of the Enlightenment having been realized, and having that ability to speak freely, which has got to be the most foundational freedom to any other freedom that one can benefit from in society, that anyone could determine or make the decision as to what those things are. I mean, the very idea that Mark Zuckerberg could decide that X is unsafe, unless, of course, the FBI advises him as such, is it's bizarre, not only on its own terms, but also by the virtue of the fact that the societies that have experienced free speech have benefited hugely from it. They are stronger, richer societies in every sense of the word.
Yeah. I guess let's try and steel man this idea that certain points of view are unsafe and it's right to protect people from them. When people claim that certain points of view, I mean, let's take as an example, saying that trans women aren't women. That would be something that many people think is an unsafe opinion to express and in some way harms trans people, trans women. And I guess they mean it in three ways. First of all, they mean that just hearing that may prompt some people to actually commit violent acts against trans women. And I suppose you could say, well, where's your evidence? Is there really a causal connection between hearing those sorts of opinions and violent acts? But they could say, well, even if there's a possibility, even if it's improbable that it will lead to violence against trans women, if that's even a possibility, if it conceivably could, then that's reason enough to ban it. If we protect one trans person from violence, then that's reason enough to prohibit people being able to say trans women aren't women. And then there's a second argument, a second form of harm they're thinking of, which is psychological harm. Okay, it may not lead to violence against trans women, but it could be traumatic for them to hear that. They're already psychologically fragile, vulnerable, at least some trans women are, and merely to hear people say that, what they perceive to be something transphobic and bigoted and hateful will cause them serious psychological trauma. Not all of them, but some of them. And we have a moral duty, to prevent that harm befalling an already beleaguered, at-risk, vulnerable group. I think you can sort of say, well, you know, should decisions about what speech to ban, not to ban, be informed by that kind of extreme safetyism? Isn't that a kind of over-application of the precautionary principle? Do we really want to restrict speech if it could harm people in those ways without any evidence that it's likely to? But then there's a third argument which I think is harder to rebut, which is that the trans woman will say that her very identity depends upon a conceptual framework which she believes to be true, which is that sex is a social construct, and it's a spectrum, it's not binary, it's not immutable, and it's perfectly possible for people to be born in the wrong body, and so on and so forth. And if you challenge that conceptual framework, if you say, no, sex is binary and immutable, and trans women aren't women because they don't possess the appropriate chromosomes, you are challenging that conceptual framework, and by doing so you're challenging the foundation of their identity. That's what they mean, I think, when they say that they're being erased by hate speech. So in that sense they're made to feel unsafe, in that their identity is contingent upon a rather contentious theoretical framework which may be at odds with reality, but nonetheless you are, in a sense, erasing their identity if you point out the kind of inconsistencies in that framework, or if you say it's completely at odds with biological reality. And that's so they think they should be protected from people making that kind of challenge to something that is at the root, the core of their identity, and the people they believe themselves to be. How do we respond to that?
I would say that you have decreasing strengths in those arguments as you go, because with the first point that you started with, that speech that denies the validity of another's self-description can promote violence. I would say yes. And as free speech advocates, we must not shy away from that reality. There are some that I come across that they in our movement that go, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me, and almost try to rob speech of any real power. The only reason I am a free speech advocate is because I truly believe speech does have such enormous power, and we need to allow that power to help develop our societies. But there can be a cost with that as well. And you look at the conversation in the United States around, is a black man 60% of a white man? They were denying the full humanity of those individuals as well. And of course, that frequently and tragically led to violence. And so I think with that point, we have to concede, yes, if we allow this conversation to be defined by particularly hateful, dismissive rhetoric, there could be violent consequences from that, and of course that would be beyond the free speech pale. But then we progress more and more towards it, this notion that that speech is violence, and that it has a psychological offense, and then even more, that even just denying my identity at all is off the table. And I think within that, more and more, we not only try and stop someone from physically impacting us, but we try and control their words. We try and control their thoughts ultimately. And so I think there's a progression there of weakening arguments that actually defy what free speech can do. If you look at the last one, what you're saying there about identity, every identity in our societies have to validate themselves, and often have to remain validated and withstand that criticism, and continue to insist on their own validation. You look at the response of some ethnic minorities to racists. They are trying to deny the validity of their identity as African American or Maori here, or other races, and often actually in the process of validating their identity, they are stronger. They become more assured of the correctness of their views. And that's what free speech does. And so I think actually you've set up three very interesting points there. And as we work through them, we see that they're grasping at straws more and more and insisting they have a right to silence others. And I think perhaps the trans conversation is different in the UK than perhaps it is at other parts of the world. With Kathleen Stock and others that have been platformed, it seems to have come to a different tenor, but I think the general point around people being allowed to make statements that perhaps even appear to be harmful, potentially harmful, that may deny an identity or run the risk of psychological harm. We must defend even this speech, because all identities that have asserted many identities that have asserted themselves have a good track record of actually using free speech to legitimate themselves. And you think about the opposition to the homosexual community through free speech, not through controlling speech. They made their case. And I think the trans community would actually work more strategically if they use speech to make their case rather than trying to silence others.
I have to absolutely agree on that, because I mean, if you look at the situation in places like Uganda and Malawi, particularly a place like Uganda, it often comes up, where you have something we wouldn't even think about anymore, about the legality of homosexuality being outlawed and literally subject to incarceration. And what you get a sense of is that you're dealing with a minority group of really beleaguered people who, by virtue of not being able to make an argument because they are repressive societies, both because of the repression and the clamp down on their ability to present the very argument you're suggesting, which I'd agree with. Nothing changes. When you look at, for example, at South Africa, where the acceptance of homosexuality has been, in the last 25 years of democracy, has developed hugely. But in a country such as ours, you have the dichotomy where you still have sort of old systems of belief where corrective rape is seen as a way for men to deal with lesbians. So we're very much that sort of mix of the two types of societies. But the difference is where those attitudes don't tend to hold sway, and have gradually, over the 25 years of democracy, people have been able to talk more and more. And I think this is a fundamental thing about any form of hatred or dislike. You actually cannot change people's attitudes to things. To think that you can, I mean, we have it. It's a battle now with the government about rooting out racism. I mean, with all due respect, nobody's going to root out anybody's hatreds or dislikes. But what a society does, where it allows speech to be expressed on both sides, and therefore the tolerance at least is to listen and to hear, is that society learns without it being made legally an obligation is that you keep your attitudes to yourself, but your behavior is moderated by virtue of what becomes acceptable in a society that has more and more of the facts. And I mean, the awful thing about trans debate is the fact that it's a specific interest group. It's the effects that it experiences or is worried about experiencing can be experienced by a whole lot of minority groupings, and is experienced and has been for decades, and fashions sort of change. So there's nothing in and of itself that makes it that should make it subject to not having the other side heard, particularly when you're dealing with arguments that essentially are perhaps have a much stronger basis in truth, particularly the biological argument. And I've read quite a lot from trans journalists who clearly do not see this because it disempowers in a way, because that increasing victimization and that need for protection from the society makes them more and more victims, and they are not empowered unless they're threatened. It's not good for any interest group, and trans, to my mind, should be no different.
But with Toby's comments have been started around hate speech, you think of the comment by Mahatma Gandhi that you cannot legislate affection, and I think that's what you're commenting on there, aren't you, Sara? And whenever our states attempts to look, I don't know if this is a term used internationally. In New Zealand, we talk a lot at the moment about social cohesion, and I think it's a bizarre and very clunky way of trying to talk about a society getting along tolerantly. It sounds like something that I think would come out of China or Russia. I'm not sure who was the comms person developing that term, but we talk about social cohesion, and that does not mean we legislate. We use the law to force everyone to stand in a circle and sing Kumbaya. And this is why I think the free speech movement at times can be on the back foot a little bit of people saying there is hate speech, there is misinformation, there is harmful speech, and yet it is kind of important that we let people have their say as well. And it's almost a footnote at the bottom of journalist articles quite often, whereas in reality, history has shown us that free speech is the most useful and efficient rights to lead to rule of law and to lead to the freedom of the press and ultimately to social cohesion. We should be starting our statements with free speech enables these freedoms, and there are some complexities at times that we need to navigate. But if we put it the other way around, I think our societies are then primed to accept that the rights to debate and the ability to disagree is crucial in humans living together in non-violent ways.
Okay, so I think we've identified the first major threat to free speech, which I think is something all three of our societies have in common, which is this notion that certain historically disadvantaged, vulnerable groups need to be protected from hate speech, because hate speech may lead to violence being meted out to these groups. It may lead to psychological trauma, and it seems to threaten the conceptual frameworks within which they validate themselves and get a sense of kind of how they identify. So there are these kind of prohibitions on hate speech, and then I think the second major threat, and I'd be interested to know the extent to which it's also true in South Africa and New Zealand, is this kind of war on misinformation and disinformation, which seems to have really ramped up in the past 21 months or so to coincide with the pandemic, and the idea that challenging the wisdom of the lockdown policy, questioning the science behind some of the COVID restrictions like masking and social distancing, and in particular raising doubts about the efficacy and safety of the mRNA vaccines, that is harmful misinformation and disinformation, and it should be prohibited for public health reasons, to protect the public. But more broadly, I think there is this kind of we used to in the West believe in the counter-speech doctrine, that the best remedy for bad speech, including false speech, was not to suppress it, but just to allow for more speech, so the stuff which was wrong can be rebutted in the public square. And that was very much the doctrine set out by Louis Brandeis in a famous Supreme Court judgment, I think in the 1920s, and seemed to be the dominant view of the kind of educated liberal elites until quite recently. But there's been a sort of change of view in the past 15 years or so, perhaps coinciding with the emergence of social media, which is that now some speech is so dangerous, so disruptive to democracy, poses such a challenge to the integrity of the democratic process, and may have played a part in some of the populist revolts we've seen in the past 10 years or so, thinking of the election of Donald Trump in 2016 and the Brexit vote in the UK and the success of Bolsonaro and other populist leaders in Poland and Hungary and elsewhere. Now there is this sense that in order to preserve the integrity and safety of democracy, we need to prohibit certain forms of misinformation, disinformation. We need to clamp down on conspiracy theories. That's the other, I think, in the UK anyway, the other great threat to free speech. Is that also true of South Africa, Sara?
Funnily enough, not really. And it may have to do with the fact that when democracy began, people coming out of the apartheid era were free to speak out and did. I mean, letters to newspapers, radio chat shows, and South Africans have become, across the board, have become very used to expressing their views, good, bad, or indifferent, articulate, not so articulate. It doesn't matter. The space is there and people learn to use it. We did have, again, it wasn't so much what was coming out of the public's, from the public about the lockdowns. There were huge debates and there were letters and articles one way and the other, and we saw it even on our the institute's opinion portal, and really some fairly robust stuff. And I get letters with a view that was along those lines, was how dare anyone say anything like this, because we'll go to hell. But it was, we were allowed to have our bluster. Our biggest problem, in fact, was the managing of the lockdowns by government and the severity of it, for all the reasons that I think, certainly I know experienced in the UK. Our biggest problem, of course, is because of very high levels of poverty. The impact on the economy was just disastrous. I mean, the economy was in dire straits before it, and they started to develop a kind of anti-lockdown sort of process and position. And that wasn't prohibited. The only problem is that once the government got that sense of power, and therein I think lies part of the problem. To get it to shift was almost impossible. It was like they called it the National COVID Command Council. I mean, CCCP. I mean, it suited them beautifully. But the one advantage about having an inept government is that at a certain point, it eventually couldn't sustain it 2 years later. But from a speech point of view, we weren't that prohibited. Probably the areas, ours is just probably less and a bit more subtle, is what we have found is to some extent in certain of the media, you often will specifically be mentioned negatively, you can't get right of reply if you are, and in some of the media, and screening of calls from the public on radio, gradually seen certain views heard less because they are screened out from radio. But it tends to be, funnily enough, in the private media, such as private radio stations. So it's not the problem for us that it is for you. I think it's almost because there's only so much we can handle at one time. So that's
interesting. Yeah, I think one of the distinctions between those two threats to free speech is that the first one often takes the form of laws prohibiting certain forms of speech, whereas the second one doesn't take that form. I mean, there's certainly efforts by the UK government. It's set up various anti-disinformation units, and those units then lean on mainstream media and social media to remove content they regard as harmful misinformation or disinformation. But they don't threaten them with massive fines or imprisonment if they don't comply. It's sort of pressure, but it's not. It's a sort of indirect pressure. What about New Zealand, Jonathan? How much of the is there anything like the same threat to free speech from people who want to preserve the integrity of the democratic process and want to suppress, therefore, opinions they disagree with, but we shall describe as misinformation?
Absolutely. The notions of dis and malinformation are some of the most prominent in the conversation around regulation at the moment. We have what is called the content moderation review going on, with the Department of Internal Affairs is looking at the entire censorship regime that we have here in New Zealand. I'm not sure what it's like in South Africa or the UK. We actually have a chief censor's office here. I think it operates similar to your Ofcom, but they're looking at whether this is going to be entirely revamped, and it's all in response, as you say, to this elite hysteria, I think, that has emerged around what is at stake here. I think I would push back a little bit, Toby, at what you've said around the fact that this has emerged because there is certain speech now that is believed to be so dangerous. I'm not sure that's the characterization, as I think the same speech now exists as has historically existed. It's more the means of dissemination and the ability to receive wide followings, and exactly as you said, it's associated with social media because of that. And so for that reason, I'm very interested in the comments and the insight of Jacob Nchangama, the historian who has done a fantastic job in Free Speech: A History of looking at 2,000 years of this notion of the idea of humans being allowed to speak freely, and you look at his very expansive chapter on the Reformation and the printing press, and I think there are many commonalities between the elite hysteria and the attempt at censorship and crackdown that emerged kind of in the 1500s, around that period, and then what we see now through social media. But there have been iterations, perhaps to a lesser degree, over those times as well, I think, with radio and with television, and just generally when the public and the average man has access to more information, that not necessarily factual information, that's not a precondition, not necessarily correct, not necessarily eloquent or thoughtful, but an ability to include them more and more in conversations. Our institutions fear that quite often, and certainly the elites and those that hold power are threatened by that. And so I think that is a key defining aspect of the conversation that is occurring around mis and disinformation. And in New Zealand, we had what was a visceral and at some level problematic episode last year, where for almost a whole month there were about 1,000 people camped out in front of our parliament that had occupied the area directly in front of it, closing many of the surrounding streets. People couldn't access businesses there, and even still there are very wide opinions on that. It's similar to the trucker convoy in Canada in a way. It took inspiration from there, and even amongst the tens of thousands of Kiwis that support us, I think there are very wide opinions on what went on there. Certainly the mainstream media's perspective is that this was a group of entirely misinformed, manipulated people, and an interesting part of that, I think, then draws in this element of class in who is allowed to speak and how are they allowed to speak. And so the defining aspect of that protest was that they were very disorganized, comms wise, ironically, logistically, and in terms of funding and food, etc. They were very well organized, but their message wasn't very clear. What they were standing against wasn't always very clear. Who was present and why they were there wasn't always very clear. And I think you can dismiss them at one level, but I, as I'm sure your organizations do as well, we're very intent on drawing in the left and the right, and those that are on the left in our organization that try and emphasize the working man and kind of more traditional unionist perspectives and such. For them, this was a very key issue. They said they're plumbers and they're farmers and they're teachers. They're not comms experts. They all work for the government. Of course, their comms strategy isn't clear. Of course, they can't all really agree amongst themselves exactly what they're fighting is, but their voice still still matters. And I think, within the free speech debate, we draw on many other civil liberties. And it's important that we distinguish those civil liberties, that they're not free speech, but of course they're founded by free speech. But we also draw in many other really important discussions that I think have been part of the progress of society. And the fact that even plumbers should have a voice. I think it's troubling that in 2022, then 2023, now we are still having to assert and defend that statement.
So, yeah, I think you make an important point about defending people on the left as well as people on the right, because one of the challenges we face in trying to defend free speech, particularly persuade young people that it's something worth defending, is that it often caricatured as something which will benefit people on the right, but not people on the left. So it's important, wherever possible, to defend people on the left as well as on the right. Have you had any success with that, Sara, in South Africa?
Yeah, it tends to be there tends to be a bit of a schism. But for example, I mean, certainly we have a constitutionally guaranteed freedom of speech, and the limits are very narrow. They really deal with propaganda for war and advocacy and hatred. Advocacy of hatred based on certain grounds, and incitement. So the two have to go together before it'll be circumscribed. There is legislation that's broader, and we argue, that it's actually probably constitutionally challengeable. But I think it's partly because we do have that sort of that distinct set of elites, but it's relatively small compared to a population that is working class and poor on a much just numerically much bigger. But obviously, one of the concerns is that the elites do tend to have the access to the expression of information. But you'll mostly see the complaints about misinformation, disinformation coming from the left. And it's although people in the middle and working classes will often be absolutely offended, how can you even say that one of our race-baiting politicians has the right to say something racist? You can they are amenable to understanding why it's important. And God knows we'd have to go to bat for the economic freedom fighters who are Marxists in the everything you don't possibly want, and hate speech is very much part of their armory. But unless it contravenes the constitutional, we would say they have the right to say. And so that's something we feel is an important thing to present. But as I say, I think part of the advantage is that the elites will have some influence, obviously, of particularly the mainstream media and in creating successful private media, but it's nothing like the issues the UK faces and America with the claims of misinformation and disinformation. And I agree. I mean, I think the best way to deal with an argument is the opposite argument, and that literally is the way societies move towards a tolerance, if not agreement. Agreement is, nobody wants agreement.
I wonder if I can just jump in there. You said a distinction between when the EFF is speaking, as long as it is still not contravening the constitutional protections of speech, that it is your responsibility to stand with them. Absolutely. I wonder how you guys are navigating this question. Something that the Free Speech Union in New Zealand is having to assess is what happens now, even when perhaps it does contravene, in your case, the constitutional perspectives, but actually philosophically it is still defended by free speech. We find some limitations on speech in New Zealand have been legislated against. We don't have like the UK, we don't have a singular constitution, but around you, there was a conversion therapy legislation that was passed last year, for example, which limited the speech of parents to a certain extent. And we're kind of navigating now going, well, what happens if someone is brought before the courts on this? It is ostensibly against the law, but it is our still responsibility to stand against that and go, but free speech guarantees this? I don't know. Have
No,
either of
it
you?
is tricky. And funnily enough, I was talking to an advocate that we've done some work with, not the Free Speech Union, we're too new for that, and talking about how in trying to be predominantly an advocacy group, we've got to look very carefully at the sort of litigation that we would be prepared to get into. For example, you don't easily want to get into defending the EFF's right to free speech, because you by implication, people are going to look at the fact that you supporting their right to say the most abysmal things. So in that respect, we do recognize that we have to be strategic, and whether it be by application or friend of the court or whatever it is. But I mean, I put out a note, I think, on Facebook that said that, people, I think I was boldest to say people have the right to be offensive. That doesn't, the right to be offensive in that they can say something or do something offensive, but that doesn't mean that there aren't consequences. And I think what we've been trying to indicate is that within society, both public opprobrium and pushback, as well as in certain legal cases like defamation, civil defamation, we have a problem with criminal defamation, but with civil defamation, you do take risks, and risks can involve risk to reputation, a whole lot of other things. But that's largely society's response to the wisdom or the ugliness of what has been said. And so what we try to say is that being entitled to say something doesn't necessarily mean it was a smart thing to do.
Yeah, we've got a case that we've got involved in over here, which illustrates that problem. Which is there is a Scotsman who said when Captain Tom, this 100-year-old ex-soldier who raised a lot of money for the NHS by walking around his garden during the pandemic, he died, and this Scottish chap tweeted, "The only good British soldier is a dead British soldier." And his friend quickly pointed out to him that this was unacceptably offensive, and he deleted it within about 15 minutes. But by then someone had already reported it to Police Scotland, and he was duly arrested and prosecuted for breaching, I think, Section 127 of the Communications Act, which prohibits saying grossly offensive things. And this was judged to be grossly offensive, and he wasn't given a prison sentence, but he was nonetheless found guilty and sentenced. And we're helping him appeal that verdict. And we hope the case will eventually go to the European Court of Human Rights, because we'd ultimately like to see fewer people, if any, prosecuted for saying something the state deems grossly offensive. But we initially found it quite hard. We started a fundraiser to raise the money his legal team needed to challenge this, to appeal this verdict, and it proved initially quite difficult to kind of meet the target because it's not a very sympathetic cause. But I think it is important to defend the right to free speech of people, even when they say things that are very offensive.
And picking up the arguments for free speech, it also, I'm sure, proves an opportunity for you to go to your donors or those sympathetic and bring them further down the line of why free speech matters, and use it as an opportunity for education. I'm sorry, that's a shocking story, Toby. I would love to hear anyone try and explain to me the difference between that and Salman Rushdie's fatwa. They neither anything more than offense, are they? It is to say that you have offended us, and therefore there should be retribution for your speech. It's interesting. I wasn't sure whether you were going to say that it was because of the gross offense, or no, the only good British soldier is a dead British soldier, whether it's an incitement to violence. That's the line that they would try and take in New Zealand, which of course is beyond the pale of free speech. But at offense, we have so many illustrations where it doesn't relate to our values that we've stood up against that in the past.
We had a very similar case, and we seem to have a racial incident, a public, very publicly followed racial incident every December, because it's our main holiday period, probably the same in New Zealand. And we had that 4 or 5 odd years ago, where a woman, was racially offensive, but I mean, you could tell by the tone that her worldview was, shall we say, a little narrow, but she wasn't by nature mean. And the ANC dragged her through the court so quickly. I mean, she got every possible equality court fine, and they were then going to refer her for criminal defamation. I don't know how they were going to prove defamation of 58 million people, but be that as it may. And the point was that, between the sort of pushback on social media, the reports in the newspaper, the reaction from her friends, to my mind, and I don't think I've changed my view, is that was the solution to the mistakes she had made, with the errors that she'd made in expressing the views the way she did. By dragging her through this poor woman died of cancer within a year after this happening. And it was where the self-righteousness of the anti-racist, and I probably mean anti-racist, they sought to destroy there was no nuance in this. They sought to destroy this absolutely defenseless woman. And there was obviously, people did take offense, but you could tell by the responses, angry as they were and offended as they were, none of them was going to slink off into the night and throw themselves under a bus. It just, people reacted as one would expect people to do. And most people said what she said was terrible, but what followed was completely disproportionate. And I think that's probably one of the key problems with authority in the elite, is the disproportion of their power, exactly as Toby experienced it, over the ordinary guy who's going to say something inelegant, shall we say, and in this case, his friends put him right quickly. And that's how societies should work. That's how you learn very quickly from that.
Tell us about some of your successes, Jonathan, because there was a proposal to criminalise hate speech in New Zealand, seemingly as a consequence of the mass shooting in Christchurch. But it's recently been sort of put on hold, hasn't it? Thanks in part to your efforts.
Well, no. About a year ago, it was put on hold, and now we've seen them fully back down. The Free Speech Union New Zealand came out of the Free Speech Coalition, which was founded in 2018, and then, yes, of course, in March 15th, 2019, there was this horrific attack where over 50 Muslim worshippers were killed in Christchurch, and out of that, a Royal Commission of Inquiry was established, and one of their suggestions was that we reform our hate speech laws. And New Zealand did already have hate speech laws on the books. There were criminal proceedings and civil proceedings. The civil proceedings had been used once, the criminal proceedings had never been used. So despite their existence, there was a culture of restraint around them. And the Minister of Justice proposed quite far-reaching reforms that would both drastically increase the criminal consequences, going from 3 months imprisonment to 3 years, and from $7,000 fine to $50,000 fine. And so that was really increasing the ante, as it were, of the states there, but also increasing the number of groups that were protected classes, changing the criteria for what would constitute hate speech, and really the technicalities aside, it came down to whether we were inciting offense against an entire group. Just offense or insult would be enough to constitute that. And so this was really a shifting point for the Free Speech Union, which had gone from a relatively small volunteer organization to stepping into the fore at that point. And we ran the most successful public consultation on a ministry consultation ever in New Zealand, and managed to get 80% of the submissions on this, tens of thousands of submissions, endorsing our claim that hate speech laws don't work. And it's really that simple. The work of Nadine Strossen, for example, is very helpful in that. And again, not making this a partisan issue, people from the left, people on the right, but everyone's saying, actually, you hurt the minority, you hurt the vulnerable more when you silence this speech. And so it was through that campaign that a lot of Kiwis initially became aware of our work, and have since gone on from that. As you said, the response prompted the government to take a step back and go, hang on a second, we may have opened a bit of a can of worms here. And they kind of fumbled the ball for about a year. And after some real pressing, the government finally came out and said that they will be dropping 5 of the 6 proposals entirely, and of the 6 proposals, the one to increase the number of groups present, they will only be taking one part of the proposal, which is to include religious communities and speech against them. And so we do see that direct correlation between the Christchurch attack, absolutely gross violence, a terrorist attack against a religious community, and the claims is that there is speech associated with that. To that point, I would say that no way to minimize the harm, the actual harm that did occur there. This was a lone Australian gunman who legally acquired a weapon, and until his manifesto was published, had very little presence online that would have indicated that he was going to take a terrorist attack. So the link between speech, what I think is a fixation on the pathologizing of speech as a connection to terrorist attacks, it may or may not be more legitimate in other cases. I'm not an expert in that regard. Certainly in this case, it's not. But nonetheless, we feel like we have been far more successful than we ever thought we would be in drawing a public consensus across the board around the fact that Kiwis do not want the government limiting what offense they can provide. And in New Zealand we have a very unique political situation at the moment. We have the German MMP system, so we were never designed to have majority governments as you guys do, but nonetheless, for the first time under the system, we do have a majority government. When we went into this campaign, we had no reason to think we would be able to stop the government from doing this. And so really, a shout out to the tens of thousands of Kiwis that joined us in this. It's a credit to good old people power. And from that, we have seen that there is buy-in, there is investment and interest in an organization fighting in many other regards. So another success that you're familiar with, Toby, as well, is what we call the Listener 7, where a group of highly prominent, some of the most prominent scientists in New Zealand wrote an article about the inclusion of what's called mātauranga Māori, which is the Māori way of viewing things and kind of their scientific perspective. These scientists said mātauranga Māori is valuable, its cultural importance is undeniable, but it is not the same thing as science. Science is a process, not an end goal. And for this, there was great outcry, and we were also able to stand up with them and the Royal Society here in New Zealand. 2 of the authors were members of the Royal Society. They were threatened to be expelled. We stood with them. We've had engagement with vice chancellors at universities around the country on this issue, and through opposition to free speech, in the spirit of free speech, we have been able to outline the reasons it is such an important cause. So those are just 2 successes. But, I think as those that are part of standing up for this basic right, there is reason to be hopeful. Let's not catastrophize around the world. Also, there is a reawakening of an awareness of the importance of this value.
What about in South Africa? Tell us, have you? I know you're quite young
Yes.
as an organisation, but have you taken on any cases yet?
We haven't taken on any legal cases yet. As I say, we're really trying to solidify a strategy around that. But what the Institute of Race Relations, which is the sort of parent body of the Free Speech Union South Africa, it's very much the way we work is to make representations to government, to appear at government, to get petitions, to get into the media. And we've seen ourselves get into the media more and more, even though we're usually dealing with media that's not aligned. And that puts us in quite a nice position to the FSU, in that when I mentioned to Toby previously, we challenged, or warned rather, a provincial Minister of Education that the presence in the now new presence, because it had existed in the elite schools, into government schools, of critical race theory and critical gender theory was shutting, really teaching kids to shut down speech. And we suggested that they need to be cautious about using consultants who propagate this view. And they ignored us. And then the thing went boom, exactly as we warned them against. And we got a lot of coverage just by virtue of that. So it was sort of being out there, even though initially it was only directly to him. We were being sort of polite and helpful and constructive. And then as soon as it exploded, we put out a press release that literally said, "We told you so." Yeah. Consequence is the the MEC for Education contacted me and said, "Can we talk about this? What do you suggest? Blah blah blah." So it in that respect is kind of small. We still have a draft near law, but not yet signed into law, hate speech, because they want to now put in place the criminalization of hate speech. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're going up against. As I said, the large organization has started that, and we will pick it up. And that is the sort of thing that we would, if it needed to go to court, we would take it to court. Mm-hmm. Very often you can only, at best, push things into touch, delay them a bit. But for example, on a not related to free speech, although everything has a consequence, expropriation without compensation. They wanted to be able to, the net result is pay nothing and easily take land away for whatever purposes. And generally, we're not too sure about what the purposes would be. Went very hard, got a lot of public support behind it, went to Parliament, etc., etc. They wanted initially to actually change a provision of the Constitution. We went in, obviously a whole lot of other groups went in, and that didn't happen. So they've now chosen to go another legislation route. And the chances are that a lot of this that tends to have what I call an almost antisocial element to it, is like with or without us, or by us, however it turns out, will be challengeable as contravening the Constitution. And that is the great value of having a written Constitution that is liberal, is that the terms are generally narrow, and more as the government becomes, as the ANC becomes more desperate about trying to hang on to power, they're pushing through more draconian things that head us in a more socialist direction. So in a way, it sort of gives us opportunities to get in on the legal ground. We do, for us, the greatest threat to free speech that we see is schools, universities, particularly in schools. And of course, you're dealing with schools where the future leadership is largely going to come from. So, right. One doesn't want to see happen what's happened to you guys, or what you've been faced with. So serious wins not yet, but we carry on nevertheless.
I'm sure they'll come thick and fast. Well, look, very good to talk to you both. Fraternal greetings from London, and we should do this again. I think comparing notes is very helpful. But before we go, should we just say to people watching how they can find out more about our respective organisations? So I'll start. So if you want to find out more about the Free Speech Union, go to www.freespeechunion.org, and you can join there. You can find out what we've been up to over the past year. You can find FAQs about what to do if you're asked to declare your gender pronouns in the workplace and you don't feel comfortable doing that. It's a treasure trove of useful information and content like this. That's www.freespeechunion.org. Sara, do you want to go next?
Yeah, we're www.freespeech.org.za. Nice little tidy website. The thing that we do try and keep changing is articles under our news section, articles or reports of talks. We featured, for example, some of the first Wreath lecture, and just to get things, and that's what goes then on to free speech. Sorry, I'm just suddenly gone blank. Free Speech Union of South Africa is our Facebook page. Okay. And Twitter is at Speech Africa.
Okay, great. Jonathan.
I think some of the listeners will make the same mistake I did when I was first hired in this role. I posted on my social media, very excited to be coming on as the campaign managers of at Free Speech Union. I actually tagged your organization, Toby, because thankfully there are free speech unions around the world and we all use the same name. So keep out for the different country profiles. We are www.fsu.nz, and that takes us onto the main website. Like the others, we have blogs and podcasts, etc. Facebook is our primary means of communication, Free Speech Union New Zealand, and also Twitter, Free Speech NZ. So lots of options there for fantastic content.
Okay, great. Well, look, really good to talk to you both, and best of luck in 2023.
Very good.
Bye.
Thank you.